So let's kind of go back and look at this kind of cluster of moral concepts related to primarily to actions. So given what we've learned, we're probably already summarizing their meanings. The obligation or duty is something we're required to perform or abstain from, and that pertains to something forbidden. That is, the obligation or duty is something you ought to do. So here's our kind of our new concepts as it relates to how many ethicists claim now, because they're coming from a naturalist perspective.
Right.
So obligation and duty is something we ought to do or not to do.
Right. So in terms of taking stock, morality is personal. You need a valuer in order to value things. And without the valuer, there isn't a value. And so moral values then need a valuer. And we have various obligations, and morality is relational. You need more than just you in terms of that.
Right. An action is, right action is something we were permitted to do, which even could be something we're obligated to do, since we're obviously permitted to do something we must. A wrong action, on the other hand, is just the opposite. The terms good and bad are related to the action. And it's good for you to, for example, care for your children, but it's bad to neglect them. And there are even people that would argue against that too. But when it comes to an action being right or wrong, it's better to understand it than being good or bad. It's again this relationship and who values it and what's the value being described. On the other hand, we should apply good and bad to people. As in, it's hard to find a good man or a good woman. It's good and right for you to keep all this in mind, but you're not obligated to do so. So again, that kind of prudential form there. Yeah. And so for the next session, we need to keep those understandings when we talk about it.
Good, yeah. So the next thing he wants us to understand is that obligations are never absolute, right? That is, you always have to do them. Right, an obligation he's going to suggest here is an absolute,
which seems odd.
Yeah,
because I'm obliged to do it, right?
Yeah. Wow. If you ought to do it, then it seems like you absolutely ought to do it, right?
Right.
So he says, if naturalism is true, then what dictates or determines which actions are required, forbidden, and permitted? He says we do. Humans determine that. And the determination will depend on, notice, what humans value, right? So, different humans can value different things, and therefore they're not absolute, right? One human might value this, the other may value that, and therefore in different situations, different things are valued, and so there is no absolute value that we have to have, right? He says another way of putting this is that obligations are not, as the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant believed, categorical, but are instead hypothetical or conditional, right? So a categorical imperative is one that says you have to do it, right? It's it's wrong to lie. Do not lie. You should not lie. Right?
Maybe a list of commandments from somewhere.
Yeah, that's right. Hypothetical is a conditional type of statement, right? If you want to get to, I don't know, California from Michigan, you have to generally travel west, right? Notice that is a hypothetical. It's a conditional. It's a if-then type of statement.
Right.
So, Kant tried to say that moral statements are categorical, right? You
don't lie. You don't murder.
That's
you
right.
don't.
You just do them because that's what you ought to do. Mm-hmm. And he tried to make a distinction between categorical moral statements and hypothetical or conditional type of statements. Now, earlier he called this hypothetical or conditional prudential. Mm-hmm. So I think he's using prudential similar in the same way.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Right? So if then these conditional statements are hypothetical. And so he says all obligations or duties depend on, are conditional upon what we value. Well, if that's the case, then they're all hypothetical and there is no absolute categorical value, right? They're hypothetical. If you value X, then you ought to do Y. That's a hypothetical imperative. An imperative is like a command, right? And so he says, to put it a different way, if there's an if part, then you have to have the then part. When a parent says you ought to clean your room, there's a tacit, he says, if you know what's good for you. Right?
Depends on how many times they've asked you.
That's right. Yeah. So he says, if, on the other hand, moral imperatives are categorical, like Kant thought they were, then there would be nothing conditional about them. They'd be the form we generally expect. You ought to clean your room, and that's it.
Right.
Right?
You don't need the parent telling you that.
That's right. So categorical imperatives do not depend on what we value or anything else, right? If they're categorical. It doesn't depend on our desires, our wants, our values. It's just that's the way things are, right? And he suggests here that the philosopher Philippe Foot explains categorical imperatives, allegedly, tell us what we have to do regardless of our interest or desires or what we want, right? Mm-hmm. Regardless of all that, this is what you have to do. And she argued that no, that's not the way they work, right? They work just like hypothetical imperatives, right? In other words, intrinsic requirements in this case are those that exist in the world apart from any human dependent considerations if they're categorical. So if moral imperatives are categorical, as Kant thought and argued, then they contain only stone-cold shoulds and oughts and musts, and they don't have anything to do with our desires, our wants, and that sort of thing. Right.
And again, we're in this chapter alone, and so again, if you're kind of disagreeing with him, at least wait until next chapter.
Yeah. And he says that he thinks, but again, I think we've seen some decent reasons to deny Kant's view. Mm-hmm. If what I've said so far about morality is anything near correct, then morality is conditional upon subjective value. And if it's conditional, then it's not categorical, absolute. It is hypothetical. Right. It's an if-then type of statement.
And he started this section with if natural is true. So we always have to look at it
if natural is right. Very good, yeah. Also, morality, that is conditional upon the valuing subject. Morality then becomes conditional or hypothetical upon the valuing subject, that is the person doing the valuing, right? And so, of course, this makes morality sound pretty subjective, right? Because you need a person in order to do it, right? And that's because it is, he says. Man.
So we're no longer presuppositionalists then, because if everything's subjective, then people can do whatever they want, right? That's it. Well, wait, if naturalism is true. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, there we go.
Yeah, save the day, right?